Welcome, everyone. We will get started shortly, but I would like to give people a few more moments to get their audio preferences settled before we begin. All right. Well, hello and welcome to today's webinar. Before I hand it off to our presenters, I just want to cover a few technical details in case you haven't joined an ACRO webinar in the past. We use Zoom webinar, which is similar to Zoom meeting, except that your cameras and your microphones are disabled by default. To interact with each other and with the presenters, you have two main options. For discussion and general comments, you can use the chat button. This defaults to hosts and panelists, meaning only they will be able to see your message. However, if you want everyone to see it, make sure to select everyone from the drop-down menu. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button. You can ask questions anonymously, and you can view and comment on existing questions, and you can ask questions at any time. And now, with further ado, I am handing it off to Jim.
Well, thanks, Belma. Hello and welcome to today's session, which is, I'm going to read it to make sure I get it right, Developing Culture for Change, a panel discussion about successfully purchasing and implementing new technology. See, if I hadn't read that, I wouldn't have gotten it straight. I'm Jim Tebow. I'm the Vice President of Customer Success at EdgeNav, and I'm your host today. Today's focus is, as the title, as the subtext said of the description, on course planning and advising technology. But I'm pretty sure that the advice the panelists are going to give will apply to most, if not all, academic solutions that your institution is purchasing, is implementing, is considering purchasing, et cetera. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, who are the people you're here to talk to, or hear from, and then we'll go over a brief agenda for the session. So Dr. Kayla Charles is the Director of Enrollment Management Tech and Resources at Hillsborough Community College in Tampa, Florida. Keith Garris is Assistant Vice Provost and University Registrar at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. Dr. John Jordan is Associate Vice President of Enrollment Services at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas. Timothy Winders is Vice Chancellor for Information Services. I did apologize in advance if I tripped over people's titles. Vice Chancellor for Information Services at Purdue University Northwest in Hammond, Indiana. And lastly, my colleague, Jeff Relue, is Vice President of Sales here at EdgeNav. So the way we'd like to handle today is we're going to start with some opening comments from each of our panelists on topics directly related to purchasing and implementing technology. And then we're going to circle back and let each of them provide some specific examples from their own institutions. We'll finish with the Q&A. So as Belma said, if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A, and we'll answer them we'll answer as many as we can before we get through the end of the session. So Tim, let's start with you. In your opinion, what's one of the keys to successfully implementing technology on campus?
I think the first step is to understand what the business need is that we're trying to solve. Is there a specific problem that the university has that we need to be solved? So often we will have individual departments, academic, administrative, even with inside of IT, come and say, we have this great new thing we want to buy, here you go, implement this, without a full understanding of how that fits in with the strategic initiatives and goals of the university, and what the overall life cycle of this new technology or platform might be. So really stepping back and understanding the problem that we have that we're trying to solve before we move forward with actually procuring something.
So I'm just curious, and I completely agree, but do you still find, after I'm trying to figure out how to time box this, I'm a little surprised that we still need to say that, I guess is my point, that people still come and say, I found this great new thing, we should use it. But that still happens. You see that?
Oh, definitely. And it's as much as we try to reinforce that it's so important to meet the business needs, It's hard to overcome that individual emotional response when I'm at a conference or I have a vendor that comes to me and says, look at this new sparkly object. You have to have this and it's going to solve all of your problems. And then I get really excited about this. So I bring it forward and say, we have to do this. And I've been guilty of this myself. So we really should do this. And then when I'm challenged and asked, okay, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Being able to clearly articulate that helps put into scope both the size of the project that we're looking at, the impact, and whether we really need this new shiny object or not.
Great. Keith, I believe you have a perspective on this as well in terms of evaluating need. Would you?
Yeah, and it's a perfect segue from what Tim was just sharing. As I've reflected on this and thought about this and just in thinking in the context of what Tim shared, one of the things that I've noticed both in my current role and some of the work that we're doing, but also in previous experiences, is the idea of be careful what you wish for. So, like Tim, I've been guilty at times of running to, my, leadership and others and say, look at this bright, shiny new thing. It's going to solve all of our problems. This is something we need to, look at and act on immediately. And more often than not, there's pause and due diligence to making sure, is it actually going to give us what we need? Once you look under the hood, does it deliver everything that's been promised? But the times that we've really then started to think about and dig into those opportunities, you start, unraveling the ball of yarn. So you start understanding how interconnected everything that we do is with everything else. And so one bright, shiny thing in this area may be exciting for a subset, but very quickly you realize the spiderweb effect it has with partners across campus. And in my experiences, both success and failure has oftentimes hinged on not the expertise and the resources available, although that's a huge component, but the ability to connect and communicate with partners across campus. And sometimes beyond campus, that it could have implications with state agencies, with community partners, with regulatory agencies, whatever that might look like. And so as excited as myself included might be at times, it's almost forcing, that pause, taking that opportunity, not only to Tim's point of the business case, understanding the scope, but then really being intentional about who else needs to be included in this conversation. The last thing any of us like to do, most often, is to be the bad guy. So if something gets far enough down the road that people are really excited, we're starting to see implementation, we're starting to see adoption. And then we've got to backtrack or, change the commitment, change that, trajectory that's being worked on. And I know certainly both the running joke in enrollment management, which is the division I report to here at Purdue West Lafayette, oftentimes we're the bad guys for a variety of reasons, not because we want to be, but simply because there wasn't that conversation early enough in the process to be able to understand what is the scope, what is that business case. And again, when you have that great, bright, shiny new object, and it is something that's exciting and it's going to work well, it's also knowing that you need to be comfortable and okay with the fact that this might start to snowball into other areas, and all of a sudden your little piece of the pie becomes very, very large, and many more people have a hand in it.
Yeah, that's and I've seen that happen a lot as well. One of the things I think that when we were talking earlier that you mentioned was not only as you go through that process and as you're talking to more and more people, sometimes you also uncover that it's actually not the technology that needs to be replaced. I'm not saying we're replacing people, but there's another issue. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, I can, absolutely. And I'll certainly share some more, a little bit later as well. So I've been at Purdue in this example. I've been at Purdue and in this role for about 4.5 years. And one of the first things I heard when I arrived on campus from many stakeholders across the institution was our current degree audit solution just was broke. It didn't work. It was terrible to use. Nobody liked it. Okay, great. So I started getting ideas and understanding, and quickly realized while the tool was not successfully delivering what we wanted as an institution, it wasn't the technology that was the main problem. The underlying issue were our own processes, policies, and procedures. And so I've spent much of the last 4.5 years, both pre and post pandemic, if you want to frame it that way, having conversations of, we could take our existing solution, go out and find that bright, shiny, new, flashy option, insert it, and the underlying issues don't go away. And so we've been very intentional, and part of the reason I'm here today is the work that we're engaged in now, in not just looking at the technology as part of the solution, but also the people, processes, policies, and procedures. And this gets back to my idea of be careful what you wish for. The voices that were saying we need a new solution, well, we're delivering a new solution, but we are also completely overhauling our curricular review process, plans of study, looking at how we account for and consider degree requirements across the entirety of campus. And so something that may have relatively been a small kind of, project in an isolated area is now the first major initiative of a new campus-wide project called Transformative Education 2.0. And it is all around degree audit and planning. So again, I remind a lot of my friends and partners and colleagues across campus, this is what you wanted. Be careful what you wish for, because now you're getting it.
So not only did it snowball in terms of constituencies and people involved and sort of reach out in different parts of the university, it also left the technology arena and moved into the process and procedures side of the institution as well.
Yes, all of the above.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Keith. So Tim and Keith are both at different Purdue University campuses. So we've just heard from Indiana. Let's drop a little south now and hear from Texas. John, when we're talking about new processes, what's been your experience in terms of what needs to happen for these things to work, for new technologies to be implemented successfully?
Well, there's a lot of things that have to be in place, but one of the most critical and probably will ensure that the project fails is communication. If you don't communicate, nothing's going to work out. And Tim and Keith have already kind of popped on this entire idea. It's pulling in the stakeholders, figuring out what that purpose is, communicating to everybody involved, making sure that everybody understands what the functionality is of whatever technological innovations that you're putting into place, how that's going to fix things, and making sure people understand that it's going to, spiderweb out into a lot of different areas that you probably didn't think it was going to have that impact. And then making sure that the folks who are leading the implementation process are actually communicating it habitually over and over and over again. You cannot over communicate. When we first started doing an implementation here a couple of years ago on a software, we sent out invitations to department chairs, deans, anybody and everybody we could think of. And then we did it again. And then we did it again. And then we did it again. And I got some emails from people saying, I've already heard this. But I got more complaints from people saying, I've never heard of this, despite the fact that we've done emails and actual marketing and PR campaign to launch the entire process and gotten cabinet and the faculty senate involved and aware of these things. So we kept communicating constantly, nonstop, because as soon as you stop doing that, people will either think, oh, I thought that went away, which was an actual conversation I had with a dean when we started working on implementation within that college. It had only been a couple months, but he thought it died. So it's that constant communication to keep people involved and aware, and to understand that change is going to happen. It's going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. But we need them to communicate with us as well. So whether it's the IT side, the functional user side, or even just the folks who are kind of the cheerleaders and the administration, making sure we're all on the exact same page. And if there are questions, ask them. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Ask it, let's get it clarified, let's get it answered. Or sometimes we had folks who actually thought that a different software was what we were talking about the entire time. And we had to clarify that even further. So it's that communication being key. You can't over communicate. In fact, I would love to hear people saying, I've heard about this from 5 different areas. Great. My job is working. Then you've heard about it at least, as opposed to people saying, I've never heard of this. Really? We invited you 5 times to different things and you didn't show up. It also helps out with that entire communication part. So it's critical. Without communication, programs probably not going to get in place for you.
So over communicate again, over communicate some more, and then be redundant and communicate.
Yes,
okay.
Pretty much.
Excellent. Thanks, John. So staying on that thread of communication and getting everyone involved. Kayla, now Kayla's based in Florida at a multi-campus community college. You have 5 campuses in Tampa, Kayla?
Yep, that's correct.
So you have communication, sort of vertical and horizontal communication challenges, right? You have to manage communication across campus and manage the workload across campus. But then I know in your role especially, you're working with staff, you're working with students. How do you manage all of that?
Yes, so very closely related to communication. Obviously, as John said, you cannot over communicate. I am in the same camp with that. Whenever we launch new technologies, I do a roadshow, go into all the campuses, you bring it out to them. When we were during the pandemic, it was a Teams show, right? That we would get them all on Teams and share that information, and getting the right people from all those different locations involved. And really closely related to that too, is getting that buy-in you need, right? So as with any new initiative, buy-in is really key to a successful implementation, but also successful use of the new system after implementation. So when we think about buy-in in higher education, we also need to consider our audience, to your point, right? So for example, with a course planning and advising system, we need buy-in not only from our advising staff, but also from our faculty, and also, and most importantly, in my perspective, is our students, right? And in my experience, creating that buy-in requires a different level of effort and even a different type of effort for each of those groups. So you really have to consider that going in. Talking about any type of technology, our students, for example, tend to adapt much more quickly from a usage standpoint than staff, right? But on the other side of that, our advisors, they have a concern, particularly with a course planning system, right? Is this system going to take my job? You have to get ahead of that, right? You have to get ahead of that, make sure they understand their role in the system, how it's going to transform their role, not eliminate their role. And so you have to consider those things up front. And then also you have faculty. They have a whole other set of concerns, right? Like how this system plans courses, is that going to affect my load, right? So a lot of it boils down really, in my opinion, to building trust in the new system and the processes you're putting in place around it, communicating, knowing those audiences, which involves just balancing the right amount of involvement and the right methods of communication for each of those groups. So it gets pretty complex. Especially like you said, we have a multi-campus environment, and so our structure makes things even more complex. So it's just a lot of planning that has to go into that. Excellent,
thank you. All right, so we've heard from each of our panelists a high-level summary, and as I'm listening, I'm thinking, in all the conferences I've been to, you hear some of the same things over and over again. Communication is key. Obviously, we haven't touched on it, but executive sponsorship is necessary. But when I go to sessions or come to webinars, I always want to hear the details. Give me some details, drill down on this a little bit more. So that's what we're going to do now. So we're going to go back in reverse order. So I'm going to start with Kayla again. And I've asked everyone to provide some examples of things that have happened on campus, what's worked, what hasn't worked, to put some meat on the bones of some of the highlights they just provided. So Kayla, back to you.
Sure. So I have a couple examples. The one I'm going to start with, though, is actually EduNav. HCC, we replaced basically a paper advising degree audit type of process and our whole registration system with EduNav. So it's a very, very large project, large undertaking. And in most ways, it was very successful. I'm really proud of how we did it. It was a very successful implementation. We did a lot of things right. We met all of our timelines, some ahead of time, even during the pandemic. And because it is now our only registration mechanism, student usage is at 100%. So if you look at it from that standpoint, like, great, we did everything right. However, there were some challenges. There are some things we're still dealing with. So we did things right, like focusing on communicating with students. I kind of mentioned, that's kind of always kind of my most important concern is our students. And we did a lot right with that. We did focus groups, we gave them pizza, we got their input on the whole thing going in during implementation. We actually got them to vote on how we were going to brand the system here. We call it Hawk GPS, for example. So we did a lot of those things right. Student satisfaction has always been high. We also, during implementation, I brought in an advisor from campus to work with me for a year full-time on the project. We would not have gotten this out the door without it. That's hugely important, is dedicating the right resources, of course, to any type of implementation like this. And for the implementation part of it, we did that right. We did that very well. What we failed to adequately address up front really was the advisor buy-in, particularly like post-implementation. So what we found is that advisor usage and adaptation of the tool into like their day-to-day work has been inconsistent. We didn't really have the right champions, I think, of the project at the campus level, at the campus leadership level. If I had to go back, I would have done that a bit differently, right? This was kind of pushed out of district. We could have engaged those campus deans, those campus presidents in a better way, I think, up front. But we were really focused on getting it out the door, which we did, and just not as attuned to this as I think we should have been. So since launch, we've been trying to kind of course correct this a bit by building more trust in the system. So I did a survey back in April 2021 of our advisors. They gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It was lower than our student satisfaction. And most concerning was that 62% of our advisors said that it didn't change their approach to advising at all. When the whole, idea behind EduNav, right, is bringing it in, having the students be able to see their course plan, and the advisor's role becomes more developmental, right? They can focus more on what those students want to do after they graduate and getting them there. So that was definitely, something we didn't want to see and something we knew we needed to approach. And some of the comments we got on that, it actually really brought forward a lot of things for me that I didn't know about. Certain plans, particularly our broadest plan, our associate in arts degree plan that has a very broad elective requirement, and how that wasn't really planning the right courses, planning some upper level like science courses as electives that these students probably weren't going to want to take. And so they were, just thinking that the plans weren't optimal. So there are certain things like that I pulled out of that survey and we've been working to address. Since put together a group of advisors from each campus to review all of the plans, again, just trying to make sure we have them being as optimal as they can, increase that trust in the system. So those are some things that we're working on, but that was probably our biggest gotcha with the EduNav implementation.
So if I could sort of summarize that. So the implementation went really well, but because of the issues that you just described with the advisors, getting the results from them that you were expecting from that constituency, you didn't get it right away.
Right.
So students liked it, they were using it. That's great. That's critical. But you were hoping to improve advisor efficiency as well, and didn't get that as much right away.
Right. Yep. We're still having to work on that. And again, just hindsight, of course, 2020, right? We could have done better upfront in the implementation planning to address that, I think. And again, like I said, bringing in the right champions and campus leadership and bringing the right folks to the table to help the advisors really understand how their role was going to change and how it would benefit them and their students. We could have done that better, I think.
Great. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else you'd like to add before we move on?
I have one other example of a challenging implementation that I wanted to share. So we also, during the pandemic, went live with an online forms and a content management system. So prior to this, we were doing all paper forms. So registration forms, if they were manual registrations, all of that was paper. We did have a working content management system, though, in ImageNow. Everyone wanted the online form, so we had that business need, right? Everyone knew we needed this, and then the pandemic came and we were like, of course, we've got to get this going for our students, right? but it's been very rocky. And the reason for that really is kind of ties back to a lot of the points everyone has summarized today, which that product that we used was made solely by our IT department. There was no input from end users, even at my level, really. There was no evaluation of multiple vendors, right, to see what would best meet the business need. That discussion never happened. So we ended up with a vendor. And there were some things that just didn't quite meet our needs. It actually brought us backwards in some cases on the content management side. And just the fact that no one was brought in the loop, right, we had this heavy level of resistance to the product. So again, tying back to everything we said, the business need just wasn't evaluated properly. I don't think it was well understood from the IT management side, all the impact that this was going to have, right, across campus. And so, that's something we're still kind of struggling with. We're making it work for us, but again, it's just so important to bring the right people to the table, create that buy-in and communicate properly. So
that's great. So Tim, we'll get back to you in a minute, but you've never done that, right? As a head of IT, you've never brought in a product without involving everybody else, right?
It might have happened once or twice, and I'll talk about it a little bit. But yeah, what I heard Kayla talking a lot about is the need for organizational change management, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But that's huge. That's huge.
Okay. Awesome. All right, but before we get there, John, so you were talking a lot about communication and over communicating. Can you drill down on that a little bit more, or anything else you'd like to talk about in terms of successful or not successful implementations?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to dig down on that topic. So as Kayla was talking about getting the right people in the room, I mean, I think we've all touched on that topic itself, but also understanding how to communicate with that audience. There's a very different way of talking to faculty members versus administrators versus enrollment management personnel versus end users versus IT, and trying to bridge that sometimes even language gap. I learned so much about IT implementing software systems that I never thought I would have learned what virtual appliances are, or how servers not a single object. I mean, I got lectured so many times by our IT departments, and still do, and I welcome it because it helps me understand where they're coming from and then where I need to go and kind of bridge that gap. But you've got to communicate with folks in different ways. So with faculty members, for example, we were implementing a degree software system as well, and we were having quite a few meetings. I mean, most times we meet the department once, maybe twice. We were done, we move on. We went with this department 6 times. And it eventually took me meeting with the individual outside of the group setting in person to kind of walk through concerns, thought processes, questions that we even answered already multiple times to get that individual who was very much a roadblock to kind of view it not as a challenge on their abilities and their thought processes, but more as a way to help supplement how they were doing to make things easier for them. And that takes time. So if you're trying to bulldoze through something, you're probably going to do just that, bulldoze through something, and that's not a great way to actually build. So you have to be very careful with that.
And you're a decent sized university, right? You got about 20,000 undergrads. So your faculty, you have a substantial faculty. So taking the time to work with one, but that was an important one to work with. So that's the lesson, is sometimes you have to do that, right?
Well, it's one program. However, that program had around 7 different majors, and then different sub-major combinations within those, and some very specific rules that they put into place. But that communication component, getting them involved, helping them see the purpose, see the reason why this is so important, they finally kind of came back around to it. Are they our staunchest supporters right now? No. But are they a roadblock anymore? No. I will take that as a win any day. Yep. So that's one of the key things. As Kayla was talking about, talking with students, we reached out to students. We sent emails. We had it on their learning management system as information. It was on our website, social media. Yeah, they didn't have a clue what we were talking about. So we had to shift our entire perspective on who our audience was. And we got the advisors. We trained them in advance of it even going live, so they could actually start getting the students aware of it and helping with that entire process. We worked with the Student Government Association to help with that student-to-student communication. We texted students instead of emailing, because apparently they're not going to read an email unless you text them first about it. And we started that process, which allowed us to learn. So we've actually taken all those lessons learned and applied them to additional things moving forward. So it's made kind of that future communication process that much simpler and easier. It's been really, really important and critical to have that learning process. One of the other major things that we learn is change breeds change. So you change one thing, you're obviously probably going to be changing something else. So for example, with that degree audit system, we learned a lot more about how our degree plans were built out in processes. We realized there were several rules that were broken and we didn't know. We had extra code that was applying to processes that we'd scrapped years ago, still just laying around. So that sparked new conversations, which created kind of a different office that's now gone through and cleaned up all 6 catalogs. That then sparked a new conversation for a modified catalog process on campus that has cut down that entire build out for academic affairs from about a 6-month process to about a 3-month process.
Oh, wow.
Because of all the different offices and stakeholders are involved saying, no, that's actually not a great idea. I see where you're coming from. There's a different way we can do this. And having those stakeholder conversations to figure out what they want, what's their purpose, how can we help you achieve that? So change breeds change.
So, and in part, was this an offshoot from that over communication because people really became aware of what was going on, and to the point where they were thinking about how it impacted them and how they could improve other things? I mean, updating your catalog process and shortening that process, that annual process and cutting it in half, that's substantial. And that was never, if I understand correctly, that was never one of the goals of that project.
No. Unintended consequence, lovely one, but it was still unintended. So as Keith was talking about is that spiderweb effect. We started working on one project, so we worked with the registrar's office. They started talking about what they did and why and how. And then we started doing other implementations, realized that something's not working when we started testing. Then we figured out that we couldn't do that because this other department wanted something else totally different. So we've entirely streamlined degree plans for students. Now everything's located in the exact same place for all students. So if they change majors, they know exactly where to look for all major criteria, all minor criteria, all degree specific criteria. And it's not a reteaching process every time that happens. Now it's you already knew, now you're a new major, you now see exactly what you're supposed to be doing.
Awesome.
So change breeds change.
Excellent. That's great. That's really good perspective. Keith, I know what you were talking about is related to what John said, and I apologize if I stole a little bit of your thunder early on, but please, what's going on at Purdue?
Yeah, no, nothing stolen at all. Everything is a yes and to everything that's been shared already. And one of the things I appreciate most of these conversations is just, being reassured that we are not unique in these challenges. We all have our own, versions of this. The scale and scope might be slightly, different. But I mean, you could copy and paste almost everything that's been shared already and just insert it to the conversations that we're having here at West Lafayette. As I mentioned earlier, one of the big challenges, when I first started here was this, immediate framing that our technology was broken. Part of the history of how we got to this point is about 10 years ago, the state of Indiana passed legislation that required all public institutions to have an electronic degree audit solution for students, essentially to verify where am I in my career path and how much longer do I have to graduate. Huge emphasis around completion, around progression, graduation rates, et cetera. From what I've come to understand, and I always like to point out this was well before my time on campus, so I take no responsibility in any of this, although now we get to be responsible for all of it. I believe that decision was made in the May legislative session to be implemented that fall. And we all know how many faculty are on our campus over the summer with nothing to do but help completely revise plans of study and degree requirements. So academic advisors became the substitute for that. And so we've spent now a number of years trying to reconcile the good work and best of intentions that advisors had to do in a matter of, in some cases, weeks, to identify degree requirements for a new electronic degree audit, with faculty and curricula committees who said, no, that's not what the actual degree requires. And that disconnect, I won't say has been there ever since, because we've had some tremendous work done even over the last couple of months and certainly a few years to help address that. But, I won't call it a success or a failure yet. It's to be determined, but we've had many conversations with those partners. So again, as we referenced earlier, and as John just mentioned, you start pulling at that one string and you see how many different places it's connected. My team structurally and systematically supports the degree audit solution on campus here. And so we would have advisors reach out directly to our degree audit analysts and say, this requirement's not right. Instead of this class, it actually should be this class. Can you change the code so that I don't have to enter an exception every time a student takes that class, but so that it counts automatically? And historically, we did, because we did not feel that we were in a position to question the why. We just were here to support the needs of campus partners. And so as we start peeling back these layers and layers and really start to understand the current state of campus, we've started to ask a lot of questions of who is the owner of the degree requirements and the curriculum. We've had advisors flat out tell us, faculty committee doesn't know what they're talking about. We know the real requirements and it should be coded this way. And I'm sure no one else has experienced that. You ask faculty committee and they probably don't respond in the same way. We have a lot of great examples where advisors are part of the faculty committee conversations simply to offer perspective and insight. You say you want to offer this class, but it actually hasn't been taught in 2 years. So do we really want to consider that? Or this class is closed to everyone but students in that major. So how can a student get access to it? But then we have others that there's a very much a disconnect. And so one of the realities that we are working through is that we as an institution have to do a better job of that feedback loop. So, the faculty who are meeting, the curricula committees that are making these decisions need to understand the downstream effects of what happens if we have capacity issues in these courses and our students can't get them. And as a result, they're always taking another class. And so advisors are always entering that as an exception. Well, if everybody agrees that that's okay, why can't we have the conversation that it should be part of that degree requirement? That's not my decision to make. I'm happy to shine the light under the rock, and I make that, joke a lot that, the degree, the technology is not the cause of these issues, but the process and the work that is happening now is allowing us to better understand what used to live on paper and on Excel documents on people's computers. We now have a better understanding and a better awareness, to the dismay of some on campus, of what actually is going on and how we can try to connect the dots in all of these areas. And at the end of the day, it's been mentioned already, but I'll reiterate, the ultimate goal is to improve this process and improve the experience of our students. And there's a lot of tangible benefits along the way, selfishly for my office, for the faculty side, for academic advisors. But one of the realities that we were seeing, especially for courses, what we call hidden courses, so they're programmed into our degree audit solution, but they're not visible to students. So if you have an advisor who knows the right courses to guide you to, you could check a couple requirements off that are not publicly known. But if your advisor is brand new, or maybe is on leave, or you have to switch, you're changing a major, your experience as a student can vary dramatically based on where you sit on campus and the advisor that you're working with. Not because they don't know what they're doing and they're not great resources, but because of all of these unwritten rules and kind of assumed agreements that we have across campus. And so we are in some cases ripping the Band-Aid off. I communicated to partners across campus that effective next fall of 24, we will not have any hidden courses in the degree audit solution and in our catalog and plan a study. And we have spent, this is an example of something that didn't go as well as planned. We should have been a little more intentional in about framing what that actually meant, because we've had departments thinking the way their requirements are structured, all of their requirements are going away, and we're taking away their ability to, decide what classes count for which requirements, which was never the intent and certainly never part of the conversation. But back to the importance of communication, having input, and needing the perspective of the end users and helping craft that message certainly would have been a good thing, as opposed to playing the game of trying to, take your foot out of your mouth and correct everything, after the fact. But at the end of the day, I think as been mentioned by others, it's pulling in advisors, it's pulling in representatives from, faculty committees, from the academic enterprise. I meet regularly and have learned a tremendous amount from my director of student solutions in our IT area. But it's understanding how all of these pieces connect, because none of us by ourselves are the experts and can get anything done. But we all are experts in a piece of this that need to be part of that conversation.
Excellent. That's an incredible amount of detail, but I heard going through it exactly the same things we've been hearing, the same threads, right? How important communication is, how important bringing in all the constituencies are. And even when you make a mistake and don't, and with all the best intentions, as you said, put your foot in your mouth, then continuing that process, trying to fix it, bringing in the right people, then fixing it then. Right? Yeah,
and I would just add, I failed to mention one point that I wanted to. So for several years, as examples would come up, so advisors would reach out to myself. Our former provost came from a college here on campus, and so he had former advisors that he worked closely with that would send him examples directly, which was always great when I would get an email from the provost saying, tell me about this. I would use those opportunities to help explain and frame to anyone who would listen what it actually meant. It wasn't about the tool being broken. It was about how we have structured and built all of this around campus. And that message was able to be shared often enough over enough of a period of time that when the conversations began around this new kind of these new transformative education initiatives, degree audit was already at the top of the list, which is both exciting and terrifying, because it went from something that me and my team were kind of having side conversations about to all of a sudden being the thing that the president and the board of trustees are talking about. And it's also the first thing that we're being held accountable for as part of this. But that also meant that resources were involved. And so it went from how do I support this with my current structure in the office to how do we successfully support this across campus? So not just the budget needed for a tool, but positions and structural changes and policy. And it quickly elevated. More cooks in the kitchen isn't always a bad thing, as long as you can help guide or at least inform those conversations that are happening.
So I heard two things that I just wanted to highlight from what the last piece of what you just said. One is, you're an example yourself of be careful what you wish for, right? Yep. Because you were talking about something that was in the registrar's office that now is a university-wide initiative, but also using every opportunity to almost to sell, right? When you said, when you would respond to the provost or anyone, you would educate. You're laying the groundwork. You're over communicating. You're not just answering the question asked. You're answering the unasked question as well to try to build awareness, which I think
Absolutely.
is great.
Yep.
It's great
Yep.
feedback.
It's the conversation of, yes, this is the reality. This is why, and this is what it would take if we want to, get to, the next level.
So it sounds like if your goal was to make this important enough to get attention, you were more than successful at that.
So far.
Okay, awesome. All right. And Tim, back around to you. So you offer a slightly different perspective from the IT side. Everyone's been talking about IT, but love to wrap up with the IT perspective on all of this.
Well, I mean, there's so much that everybody has already talked about. The last thing that Keith was just talking about really tapped into the thing that you added to our opening statements, and that is executive buy-in and championing. You really talked about the transformation that has happened related to degree audit. You saw this as a need over many years. You saw it several years ago, and I found myself shaking my head. And I imagine, most, if not everybody in our audience is doing the same thing. Yes, us too, us too, us too, because it, comes down to those processes where, okay, the faculty own the curriculum, so they write the curriculum documents, and then the registrar has to implement, how the curriculum is managed within the degree audit system. But then you have advisors that say, no, we know better. We're going to override that and give exceptions to it without the feedback loop back to the faculty that said, oh, this is what's happening. And so it really wasn't until you had that complete awareness at the executive level, the provost office, the president's office, the board of trustees, that we said, wait a minute, this is a problem. We need to fix this. And so we now are able to get resources, dollars, funding, people involved, dedicated to looking at this process to fix the process. Here at Purdue, it's under the umbrella of transformative education 2.0, but I think we all have these same issues. As I look at it from the technology perspective, it always goes back to the what's the business need. And if I step out of the registration and registrar's area for a second and think about what are some drivers that help drive change at the university. Sometimes the change is not anything that we can control. It is often a vendor that says, yeah, we're not going to support that product anymore. You have to do something different. And so I think of a very successful project that happened over a couple of years here, changing and implementing a new learning management system. And when we learned and knew that the vendor was sunsetting the solution we were using, then it very quickly became a conversation of, cool, what do we want to do? And then involving stakeholders from across the campus, across all of our campuses, to really get involved and decide, well, what are our problems? What would we like to see? What would best practices look like? Interviewing other campuses and universities across the country to find out, how do we design what our requirements are? And taking a full year in the planning processes for design what our business requirements are for the solution that we need. And then when it comes to implementing, working with all the stakeholders, right? So in this case, you've got students and faculty and administrators and staff that are involved in the discussion of, what does a learning management system look like? And it's really no different than what a degree audit system would look like. You need to have all the same people involved in those conversations to decide, how does this work in our environment? What do we want to get out of this? And of course, IT is part of those conversations in a successful project from the very beginning. And not just defining, what does a successful project look like and all the business requirements, but then helping to interview vendors and design what an appropriate business case would look like, and how do vendors come in and present a solution that can demonstrate their option meets the business cases that you want to have success with. So really creating partnerships across the entire university. And then for us, we happen to be finishing the implementation of our new learning management system right at the end of 2019. Well, we all know what happened in 2020. We were scheduled to have a year overlap where we're going to be running both systems concurrently. Well, under the umbrella of never let a good crisis go to waste, we very quickly were able to say, no, that's a really bad idea. We're going to sunset this legacy system. It's going to be used through the end of the summer. We're all already remote anyway. We're having to learn how to teach remote. We need to build all of our new courses in the new system so they all can be taught 100% remote, and we're going with that brand new in the fall. I looked at that example to say, universities don't have to move at glacial speeds all the time. We have the ability to be nimble and flexible if we want to be, or if there's the right crisis that we have to respond to. So executive buy-in and championing. I think several of you mentioned pulling at threads and the overlap of all of these different things from an IT perspective. I get concerned about scope creep. We talk about this like, oh, well, we want to implement a new degree audit system, and then it's, oh, but we need to look at our curriculum management. Oh, and what about our course catalog? Oh, our advising also needs to change. And my head explodes because we went from something that was we could have 1 to 2 years to this is a 5-year complete major transformation of 17 of our different business processes. But we're going to do it with just the same team because it's all the same part of the project, right? So IT, we call it scope creep. Keith, you said pulling on threads, and be careful what you wish for, because it's all going to happen. We all will run into bottlenecks. We all have the same problems. And ultimately mention it so many times. Organizational change management is huge. If you've got IT that's leading a project, there has to be somebody that's responsible for communication of that. If the registrar is running a project, there has to be somebody responsible for communication of that. Somebody has to be responsible and take ownership, no matter who is owning the project.
And communication is not an afterthought. Communication is a core process.
Exactly.
You did say something, though, that I thought was very interesting. You didn't quite say it, but the way I heard it was when you heard from the vendor, the learning management system vendor, that they were sunsetting the project. That's a problem, but you turned it into an opportunity, right? It's obviously a problem. You were going along, happy, everything was fine. All of a sudden now you've got this thing in your lap, but let's turn it into an opportunity, right? It's
yeah. I think it has to be.
Of lemons, let's turn
it really goes back to the question of defining the problem, right? And if you have a successful product or technology that meets half of my needs, or maybe 80% of my needs, the lift to change that to something else that meets 100% of my needs is significant across the entire organization. And that's on a vendor promise that it's going to meet 100% of your needs. It may or may not. You may end up in a worse situation than you were before. So it's the bird in the hand versus 2 in the bush situation.
Well, and actually, we need to transition to questions because we have about 8 minutes left. But I have a question related exactly to that, Tim, which is and this is, I'm opening this up to anyone. When you're looking for a solution, right? Every vendor, and I'm a vendor, so we're guilty of it too. Every vendor makes statements, makes promises, represents their product in a certain way. A lot of the times it's true. Some of the times it's not. How do you, the panel, how do you work through and evaluate that so you don't get stuck with something that isn't what you thought you were going to get at all?
Yeah, often it is asking for a live demonstration of this in use, in an in vivo demonstration. I have fallen twice, so won't fall a third time, to a vendor's presentation or recorded video of, well, this is what it does, only to realize, yeah, that's what we want it to do, and it will eventually one day, but today this is a video that we created to demonstrate what might happen. Of course, it's never presented that way. It is presented as if this is what happens. So seeing a live demo of how something actually works helps to cut through some of that BS.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and I'll even add to that. You can define upfront for the vendor the things you really want to see in that demo. So you work with those users, those end users that are the experts. You get them in the room, right? They need to be there, but they need to help define upfront what we expect to see. What are the business cases that this solution needs to deliver so that the vendor can clearly demonstrate whether they can meet those needs or not. And I found that really will draw things out, really getting into the kind of nuts and bolts of things. And again, just not being afraid to ask questions and have the right people at the table, which we've really talked about a lot today. Yeah.
Right. And when you say, Kayla, making sure you get, detailed set of questions, Keith, maybe like 187 specific use cases that you need to see, a level like that, not 4 or 5, correct? That's right. A lot.
Correct. Exactly.
All right. Jeff, do we have any questions from the audience yet? Because I have 1 or 2 more if we don't.
Actually, I think one might be coming in right now, Jim. Oh, no, it's just somebody from Acro.
Okay. So we're talking about implementation. And one of the things that I hear from customers and prospective customers and just people I meet virtually, since I don't meet too many people in person anymore, is implementation fatigue. So I don't, tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it's as easy to overcome implementation fatigue with communication, or is it? So how do we address that without just slowing down the rate of change? Because I don't think anybody's advocating for slowing down the rate of change. Well,
No, I think communication, yeah, Jim, I think communication helps kind of mitigate some of that implementation fatigue, but we can be very nimble. We can be agile when we need to, right? Or when we're forced to be, as Keith pointed out, Tim pointed out. But you have to keep in mind, not every software is going to fix everything, and you have to prioritize. And you have to be careful about scope creep. So you say, this is the first project we're working on. However, here's project 2, 3, 4, 5. Here's the timelines associated with it. We're all aware of what's going on. And we're working on this one now. And when it's done, then we'll tackle the next one. When that's done, then we'll tackle the next one. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that, IT or registrar or, whatever system you're working with is only working on one project, but you don't split everybody's focus. You get them working on things to where they can get it finished. And then the campus is going, okay, great, we finished a project, instead of, hey, it's stalled again, or it's taking another 2 months or something like that. So that helps kind of mitigate that entire fatigue component, because it's not everybody doing 15 projects once. It's everybody communicating about what's going on and then handling it as prioritized.
Is part of the way to mitigate against that fatigue then to have successful implementations, because people remember, they see the benefit right away, as opposed to long drawn out, and that's what I'm just interpreting from what you're saying, long drawn out, ever growing, never finishing implementations. And I see a lot of people.
I think so. I mean,
all right.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, again, success begets success. So you're able to build on that. But I do want to mention one thing, Jim, to your question as well, and flip around what Tim and Kayla had shared already. I think this is an example in my experience and some successes and failures that we've experienced here of needing to be as direct and transparent with ourselves as we expect prospective vendors to be, or that we're asking those vendors to be. One of the things I heard very early on as we started talking about a new degree audit solution was, whatever we do, do not tell advisors this is going to make their jobs easier. They are tired of hearing that. No one will believe you, and there's nothing you can do to undercut yourself more quickly than say, this is going to make all of our lives easier. And so we've been very clear from the very beginning, this is the old adage of, building the plane while you're flying it. It's like building a Lego set, but we don't even have the instructions yet. We're trying to figure out what pieces we have to then figure out what we want it to look like at the end. And we've tried to be as open and transparent about that as possible to help with the understanding that this is a process and we are all committed to it. We are 100% committed to this being a success, but it is going to be messy and hard along the way, but that's not a bad thing. And so really trying to, not sugarcoating this in any way, but really trying to help frame that in a realistic, transparent way.
Awesome. Thank you, Keith.
It's control those expectations. So, I mean, if everybody knows it's going to be tough, then they're prepared for it.
Yeah, right.
Whereas if things gonna be easy and it turns out to be really difficult, that's gonna hit morale pretty quick.
Right. And when they hear it again, they're like, oh, another one of these. I understand. We're at the top of the hour. So I'm gonna wrap this up. I'd like to thank each and every one of you, Kayla, Tim, Keith, John, for participating, for sharing your information. I hope this has been very helpful. Belma, I don't know if you have anything to say to wrap up, but I'd like to thank all the panelists and participants. All right. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, everybody.